Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Meta AI is the personal AI to help you with whatever you need. Plus, it meets you where you are. Not only is Meta AI now an app, but it's also on the apps you already know and love. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger. Plus the Ray-Ban Meta glasses. It's easy to access wherever you are. So whether you're talking or texting, Meta AI is convenient to use throughout your day. Experience our newest AI that's tailored to you by downloading the Meta AI app. Try the Meta AI app today on the Apple App Store and Google Play.
With EA Sports College Football 26, you can rise from high school recruit to Heisman legend or cement your legacy as a coach by leading your program to glory. Pre-order the deluxe edition of the game today as part of the MVP bundle at go.ea.com/MVP-bundle to start playing 3 days early and more. EA Sports College Football 26 is rated E for everyone. Includes in-game purchases, including random items.
Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. The sheep herder sat in the same spot, watching. It was a solitary profession, plenty of time to reflect on the beauty of the land. Rainfall was spare, a precious commodity in the New Mexico territory. However, a handful of rivers, like the Rio Bonito, or Beautiful River, had always provided enough, and the Hispano people had long ago cut irrigation channels, thereby enriching the soil and nourishing their crops. The sheep herder gazed across the grassy plains towards the expansive mountain ranges. Nightfall would be coming soon. He got up to light the lanterns. Their glow surrounded his flock. His only companion was his faithful and well-trained sheepdog, who kept the herd together as darkness descended. The monotony of the day transitioned into a restless sleep as the man watched over the darkened prairie. His senses heightened. In spite of the lanterns, flickers of light that kept the coyotes at bay but didn't stop their howling. And the mountain lions and bears, his fire kept them away. But still, they silently stalked the darkness. And there were other threats, even more dangerous to the sheepherder's life and livelihood in the 1870s. The pursuit of unchecked greed, coupled with the never-ending thirst for power. This was the new predator stalking the Hispano people. And this land they had worked for generations had been annexed by the United States after the Mexican-American War.
They had formerly been citizens of Mexico. With the conclusion of the Mexican-American War in 1848, Mexico gave up pretty much half their country, and those became the territories.
New land laws were interrupting the generational cycle of the sheep herder and the farmer, too. A battle for resources threatened the Hispano way of life.
The thing is, because Billy had been fighting against the people, the kind of people, the power structure in the territory, who the majority of the Hispano population, they considered them their enemies. So to the Hispanos, the Nuevo Mexicanos and Mexican Americans, Billy was a hero. They adored him. They looked up to him as a folk hero, and he was an outlaw. Yeah, but he was their outlaw. He was their guy. He was always very good to them, very generous with them, and he lived among them.
Because nothing can stop progress, the pursuit of unchecked greed, coupled with the never-ending thirst for power. But one man, who was really just a kid, would become the unlikeliest legend of the Wild West.
For him, violence was a means for self-defense or for vengeance, not for profit or indulgence. Billy never once shot anybody just for nothing. Just to be a jerk. And he never shot anyone for money. That was not. Billy's reasoning was, if he had to defend himself, then he'd do what he had to do. And if he was fighting in a war or something, he'd do what he had to do to survive. Vengeance or survival.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 140, The Infamous Billy the Kid.
Well, people think that they know of him as a sociopath, as like some thug, as a born criminal who was determined to become a famous outlaw. In actual fact, he was just a very affable, very popular, well-liked Irish kid of Irish heritage.
That's historian and author James B. Mills, and his new book, In the Days of Billy the Kid, take us back in time.
This is not your first rodeo with Billy the Kid.
No, I wrote a biography of Billy Bonney that was published 3 years ago called Billy the Kid, El Bandito Simpatico. It was quite well received. It's pretty, very, very comprehensive and in-depth of his life, and probably surprised a lot of people in that Billy wasn't actually really who a lot of people imagined him to be.
Billy the Kid is one of the most mythologized figures in the American West. And yet, little is known about Billy and his young life, only that he was born in New York, and his birth name wasn't Billy. It was Henry McCarty.
I call him Billy Bonney, but actually that wasn't even his real name. His real name was actually Henry McCarty. That was his real name. William H. Bonney was an alias that he took about 5 years before he died.
It's believed Billy was born sometime in 1859. He was the eldest of two boys. His parents were Irish immigrants, and when Billy was little, his father died.
His mother was Catherine McCarty, Irish woman. We don't know the name of his real father. We've got a few guesses. We don't know. According to one contemporary, his father died when he was 4.
Billy's mother, Catherine, decided to move her family out west when Billy was about 10 years old.
Catherine moved Henry McCarty, because that was his real name, and his brother Josie McCarty, moved to Indiana. They lived in Indiana for some years until they eventually arrived in Wichita, Kansas, moving further, into the western regions.
Catherine met and married a man named Bill Antrim. He was a stagecoach driver who dreamed of becoming a prospector. Billy's new stepfather convinced his mother to move to New Mexico in 1873 to fulfill his dreams of striking it rich.
He attended school in Silver City, New Mexico, and when he was about 14, his mother died. Catherine died. She died from tuberculosis. And his stepfather, while I would say he was a bad guy, he had come to New Mexico to get rich, not to look after a couple of orphans who weren't his own biological sons. And so Henry pretty much had to take care of himself.
Despite the hardships, the loss of his father, and now his mother, Billy, even at the tender age of 14, never lost his ability to connect with others.
According to those who knew him, he was a bit mischievous, but no more than any other young boy. His personality when he was younger was pretty much exactly the same as it was when he was older. Very fun-loving, very polite. His mother clearly raised him well in terms of courtesy. He was known as a gentleman. He was very polite, had a great sense of humor, loved laughing, and was, by all accounts, the people who knew him, was very easy to get along with and very affable and friendly.
However, life in the 1800s wasn't easy. On his own, Billy found out the hard way that odd jobs were few and far between, and he ultimately resorted to stealing to get by.
When his mother died when he was 14, things went off the rails a bit, and he engaged in a bit of theft, petty theft, and just seemed to drift through life a bit, not really trying to find his place in the world.
Billy got caught stealing guns and was sent to jail in 1875. As it turned out, Billy wouldn't be behind bars for long. Within just a few days of his arrest, he'd busted out and changed his name, introducing himself as Billy Antrim. Remember, Antrim was his stepfather's last name. It wasn't long before the 16-year-old got the nickname The Kid, because he was small in stature and had a boyish appearance.
Well, he was called Billy and Billy Bonney, and so a lot of people called him the Kid.
Billy found work as a ranch hand, but he also liked playing cards and drinking at the saloon. It was around this time he started wrestling horses for a living.
Horse thievery throughout Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, it was pretty much everywhere. It was almost a way of life. But yeah, it was dangerous. If you got caught, you were in trouble. You'd either get hanged or shot. But I guess in his eyes at the time, for a 15, 16-year-old orphan, you know, it was a more dependable living than gambling, I guess.
In 1876, the stakes for Billy intensified after a barroom brawl when he was just 16 years old with a local blacksmith had turned deadly.
There was a man named Francis Cahill, much older than Billy, about the same size though, much more bulkier. And he spent about 2 years tormenting the kid and harassing him, slapping his face, ruffling his hair and all sorts, just being a bully for a long time. And it all came to a head one night in a cantina, and Cahill started insulting the kid, and the kid insulted him back. And Cahill ended up, he pinned young Henry, as he was still pretty much known back then. He was only about 16, down on the saloon floor and started slapping him and walloping him in the face. And the kid decided he had enough, and he managed to pull his gun and shot Cahill in the gut once and took off. He wasn't going to wait around to see if he'd get ruled self-defense, which it was by frontier standards.
Billy left town, heading for Lincoln County in the newly annexed New Mexico territory. Now, a little history. Roughly 30 years before, the United States seized half of Mexico after the Texas Revolution and the Mexican-American War. This was an egregious power grab, prompting Ulysses S. Grant, who would become the commanding general of the Union Army, to say this, quote, "I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation." The War of the United States against Mexico began in April of 1846 and concluded nearly 2 years later with the signing of a treaty whereby Mexico ceded roughly half of their land to the United States, including Arizona, California, Texas, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado, Wyoming, and what we now know as New Mexico. And the people who lived there before had been citizens of Mexico, who were now living in America.
And so the Hispanos I call them Hispanos merely to differentiate them from the Mexicans living in actual country of Mexico. That's who they were. They were just the natives, some people called them the native New Mexicans, although some would argue that the native New Mexicans were the First Nations people, the American Indian people who had lived there originally.
Our story takes place in Lincoln County. It's where Billy the Kid went to after he shot and killed the blacksmith during that altercation. And it's worth mentioning that Lincoln County was named after President Abraham Lincoln in 1869, roughly 4 years after General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army on April 9th, 1865, and then 5 days later, President Lincoln was assassinated. A foreboding namesake after the bloodiest American war to date, where roughly 620,000 people died in the Civil War. A narrow dirt road ran through the frontier town of Lincoln. On either side of the road, there were adobe houses, and in the beginning, there was just one general store, which was owned by an Irishman named James Dolan. Dolan's store was known as the House. In the early 1870s, the House was the only store for miles, and Dolan took advantage of that, charging exorbitant prices. Dolan and his cronies also won the highly coveted federal government contract, which allowed them to provide cattle to the reservations. By then, the government had forced Navajo and Apache people onto these reservations.
This is on the American southwest frontier. This is when the Apaches were still on the warpath. This was a very, very different time and place from what we know now.
But power began to shift after an Englishman named John Tunstall came to Lincoln County with big plans to make his fortune. He bought a ranch and raised cattle, and in 1876, he opened a general store in direct competition with the House down the street. Tunstall had the courage to challenge the house because he had a local powerful businessman on his own side, a man named John Chisholm, who was a wealthy and very successful cattle rancher in the area. It was around this time that Billy started stealing horses in Lincoln County.
But he ended up just drifting around through Lincoln County in New Mexico, southeastern New Mexico, looking for work, and he also snatching the occasional horse here and there. And he eventually stole from a very ambitious, rather pretentious English merchant named John Tunstall.
Billy was arrested for the theft of John Tunstall's horses, and he was locked in the town's pit jail cell. The jail was an adobe structure, but inside, cells had been dug into the earth and thus required a ladder to get in and out of them, and their walls were lined with timber. Tunstall went to speak to the thief accused of stealing his horses, and after his conversation with Billy, he was so charmed by him that instead of pressing charges, he offered the teenager a job as a ranch hand.
He was known to have a very fierce loyalty towards those who showed him kindness. And Tunstall, but he'd given the kid a job, he'd given him a future, which was what he didn't have at the time. He'd given him a future, a horse, new guns, here's a wage, and eventually you can manage a ranch for me. For a 16, 17-year-old kid couldn't ask for more than that at the time. But
not only did Billy have a new purpose, but he suddenly had a bright future.
Tunstall's ranch was very primitive. It was nothing special, but it was still just working for him. He had a guaranteed square meal a day, breakfast, and he was making new friends, Tunstall's other employees.
But that future was cut short. The success of John Tunstall's general store in town was upsetting the house's bottom line. And the house also had issues with Tunstall's silent partner, a man named Alexander McSween, who was an attorney who had a falling out with James Dolan over a $10,000 insurance payout that was owed to the family of Dolan's business partner who had died.
Shopping is hard.
I can never find anything in my size.
I don't even know my size.
I buy my clothes the same place I buy my groceries.
There's a better way. Make it easy with Stitch Fix. Just share your size, style, budget, and done. Your personal stylist sends pieces picked just for you.
That was easy.
Stitch Fix. Online personal styling for everyone. Free shipping and returns. No subscription required. Get started today at StitchFix.com.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive, a leader in boat insurance. Welcome aboard to Carefree Boating. Here, we don't worry about the what-ifs, because we explore with Progressive Boat Insurance for as little as $100 per year for a basic liability policy. Progressive also offers a variety of other coverages and can help you cover repair costs when you need it. And with discounts like multi-policy, safety courses, responsible driver, and more, your mind can really float free. Cruise on over to Progressive.com to get a quote today and see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Rate and discounts not available in all states or situations.
BTW, FYI. Visit Nexplanon.com RN to learn about Nexplanon. It's an adjustable implant, 68 milligrams radiopaque. Or ask your HCP IRL. Okay, TTYL.
I am so excited for this spa day. Candles lit, music on, hot tub warm and ready. And then my chronic hives come back. Again, in the middle of my spa day. What a wet blanket. Looks like another spell of itchy red skin. If you have chronic spontaneous urticaria or CSU, there is a different treatment option. Hives during my next spa day? Not if I can help it. Learn more at treatmyhives.com.
2 years after Tunstall came to Lincoln to seek his fortune, a posse was being formed by the sheriff, who had convinced a judge to sign off on not only McSween's assets to be turned over to the house, but also included his business partner, John Tunstall's possessions as well. You see, allegations had been leveled against McSween that he'd misappropriated insurance proceeds after the death of James Dolan's business partner, and a warrant had been issued for his arrest. But the judge's orders had also lumped in Tunstall's assets, which was a mistake. These orders allowed the house to seize Tunstall's horses and cattle, which is why Tunstall hired men to protect him, including his then ranch hand, young Billy the Kid, who was an excellent shot. Tunstall and his men were driving his cattle and horses away from his ranch and to the town of Lincoln when Sheriff William Brady and his posse caught up with them. Billy and the other men told Tunstall to take cover with them behind a ridge, but he didn't listen. Instead, he turned around and rode his horse directly towards Sheriff Brady and his posse. Remember, these guys were loyal to the house, who wanted to get rid of their competition.
And the kid and them were driving horses up to Lincoln, and this big posse came up behind them, and the kid and the others all had the sense to spur their horses and charge. They were yelling at Tunstall, "Come, follow us, follow us." John Tunstall was an Englishman. He'd only been in the country itself, the America, for a few years. He was a little bit naive, and he rode towards the posse.
As an English gentleman, Tunstall no doubt rode toward the posse, hoping for a détente, a moment to reason with the men. But as soon as Tunstall was in firing range, a member of the group aimed his gun and pulled the trigger. From the safety of the ridge, Billy the Kid could only watch in horror as a bullet ripped into Tunstall's chest, and he instantly dropped to the ground, where he fell on his stomach. And when the sheriff's posse rode up alongside Tunstall, lying on the ground, bleeding out, that's when one of the men shot him in the back.
Tunstall was murdered, very brutally murdered, by the House, who were a conglomerate of Irish businessmen in Lincoln County. And that kicked off the whole Lincoln County War.
At Tunstall's funeral, Billy vowed to get revenge, saying, quote, "I'll get every son of a bitch who helped kill John if that's the last thing I do."
As people said, Bonnie was very loyal to those who were kind to him. And when Tunstall was murdered, well, it wasn't just him. It was the other guys who had worked with Tunstall, and they were going to get payback. Problem was, the sheriff of Lincoln County at the time, William Brady, he was a member of the House. He was a member of the Irish conglomerate. There's no definitive evidence to say that he was directly involved in John Tunstall's murder, but it's pretty clear he probably had a good idea of what was going to happen. And when it kind of, even if he condoned silence, the sheriff was less than upstanding, we'll say, at the time in Lincoln County.
Billy the Kid and the rest of Tunstall's loyal men were deputized as lawmen by the town's Justice of the Peace to serve warrants and arrest all of those believed to be responsible for Tunstall's murder, including the sheriff himself, William Brady.
Well, they were originally deputized by the Justice of the Peace after Tunstall's murder. So Billy the Kid, outlaw, was actually a lawman. He was Deputy William Bonny at that time.
But from the beginning, there was a problem.
When they went after the men who had murdered Tunstall, they couldn't hand him over to the sheriff because Brady would have just let him go.
So they went to arrest Sheriff William Brady for Tunstall's murder, but were themselves arrested and jailed by the sheriff. Then they were stripped of their deputization. After Billy was released from jail, it became abundantly clear to him and his crew that in order to get justice for John Tunstall, they'd have to form their own posse, and they called themselves the Regulators. On April 1st, 1878, a grand jury met at the Lincoln County Courthouse to investigate Tunstall's murder. And when Sheriff William Brady showed up, Billy and his regulators gunned him down in the street, thus beginning what would become known as the Lincoln War. This was a lawless time in Lincoln County, where both sides, the House, which was affiliated with James Dolan, and the Regulators, made up of men and Billy the Kid, who were loyal to Tunstall. Both factions skirted the law to exact their revenge on the others. Meanwhile, the law in town either looked the other way or actively participated in this bloodthirsty feud. However, a few months after Sheriff William Brady was murdered, the situation escalated in July of 1878 in what would be called the Battle of Lincoln, which was waged in the middle of the town.
Billy himself was involved in several shootouts and killings, but we don't know exactly how many bullets he fired or into who or which one. These were like guerrilla warfare. you could say gang warfare, but guerrilla warfare was going on throughout the county. And it all ended with a big 5-day siege in the town of Lincoln.
After 5 days, the Lincoln County Sheriff, who was also in the pocket of the house, called for troops to be sent from nearby Fort Sumner. 8 miles away, the military fort had often been called to help protect the town of Lincoln during emergencies. But when troops arrived, a large number of the regulators, including Billy the Kid, were hunkered down inside McSween's adobe-style home. And pretty quickly it became clear whose side the soldiers were on, as they positioned a howitzer, a devastatingly effective artillery weapon, and aimed the cannon directly at the front door. Then the house was set on fire, forcing the occupants to be burned alive in the fire or try to outrun a barrage of bullets. Many of the men inside died. But when Billy ran out, miraculously, the bullets fired at him didn't meet their mark.
In which the McSween house was set on fire, and Billy and a handful of their guys managed to escape. Some others got shot.
In February of 1879, Billy was tired of fighting and called a truce with the house. And yet, even after peace was struck between the regulators and the house, that night another innocent person was murdered.
And Billy was there. He witnessed the murder, but he wasn't involved in it. And the men who murdered the lawyer were the same guys who had pretty much been responsible for killing his former employer, Tunstall, his longtime enemies. This was at a peace meeting, finally to officially end the war in February 1879.
Billy used the murder to strike a tentative bargain with the governor of New Mexico Territory, who had come to the town to stop the violence.
Governor Lew Wallace, who hated New Mexico, did not want the job and did not want to be there. He came into Lincoln County, and Billy Bonney sent the governor a letter saying, look, I was there when Chapman was murdered. I'll testify as to who did it. Bonney offered, in exchange for a clean slate to start over. Because as far as he was concerned, he was on the right side of things during the Lincoln County War. That's how he felt. And many others did too. And so they made that deal, and Governor Wallace promised the kid a pardon for his involvement in the Lincoln County War, because Billy had been one of the regulators that had shot Sheriff Brady and killed him in the street in Lincoln.
Billy turned himself over to the authorities and testified. But after 4 months of voluntary confinement, he wouldn't receive the pardon that was promised, prompting him to break out of jail again. This time, Billy headed to Fort Sumner, and as a fugitive at large, not only did the governor not honor his word, he placed a bounty on the kid, a $500 reward, wanted dead or alive. The poster described Billy as being 5'3", weighing 125 pounds, with light hair, blue eyes, and even features. He was described as the leader of the worst band of desperados the territory has ever had to deal with.
And whatever the newspaper man just put it in the December 3rd, 1880 issue of the Las Vegas Gazette, when he was doing this report, it's rather elaborate report, embellished a bit, about this horde of outlaws in what was then San Miguel County. It's now DeBarca County, New Mexico. He just put the words, Billy the Kid. And Bonney, when he mentioned that in a letter he wrote, he didn't sound too impressed by the name. He was like, I don't know. He didn't really. But then Billy the Kid was never really impressed by his fame at all. He didn't care for it. He didn't go looking for it. And he told one reporter, he said, I'm getting a terrible reputation. He really didn't care for it.
On the run, Billy the Kid went back to horse rustling.
He had a chip on his shoulder, and he started rustling cattle from a lot of the rich Anglo cattlemen. He never stole from Hispanos. He didn't steal from Nuevo Mexicanos. If he had started doing that, their support for him would have evaporated very quickly. No, he stole from a lot of the rich gringos on the Texas Panhandle.
In 1880, a new sheriff, Pat Garrett, made it his mission to bring Billy the Kid to justice.
That's what brought the hammer down on him, because it wasn't so much, if Billy had been stealing from Mexicans, nobody would have cared. But he was stealing from rich Anglo cattlemen, and a lot of the Santa Fe Ring, who was the conglomerate of attorneys who pretty much ran the territory. Didn't matter who the governor was; they were pretty much running the show. They wanted the kid gone. They had been the financial backers of the guys that Billy fought against in the Lincoln County War.
In December of 1880, the new Lincoln County Sheriff, Pat Garrett, and his posse captured Billy the Kid at one of his hideouts called Stinking Springs. By this time, Billy had become infamous, and after he was captured, his reputation continued to grow exponentially, grabbing headlines across the country and the world. Billy fueled these headlines with quotes like, quote, "People thought me bad before, but if I ever should get free, I'll let them know what bad means." Billy would be tried and convicted of the murder of Sheriff William Braden, and a judge would sentence the 21-year-old to death, saying to Billy that he would hang by the neck until he was, quote, dead, dead, dead. And again, according to legend, Billy's response to the judge was that he could, quote, go to hell, hell, hell. This dialogue titillated the now legions of readers anxious to learn every detail about the cold-blooded killer, Billy the Kid.
Billy was no saint, but they did exaggerate his exploits quite a bit, and they created a superstar. He got the nickname Billy the Kid from a newspaper in December 1880, which was 7 months before he was killed. He was only known to the world as Billy the Kid for the last 7 months of his life.
And once Billy was arrested and jailed, his notoriety continued to grow.
Why do you think they chose him as the outlaw that they wanted to? The name.
He'd been involved in the Lincoln County War, but I think it's the name, Billy the Kid. It's a perfect name for an outlaw. It's so catchy. It rolls off the tongue. And that played a huge part in it. The other part was John Chisholm and some of the power players in Lincoln. They wanted Billy gone, but I think a lot of it was just the name. And it was crazy. He went, in the space of less than a month, he went from being nobody outside of New Mexico had ever really heard of him. But then why would they? He was just another rustler, just another pistol-packing rustler who gambled and whatever. There were 1,000 like him. And in the space of 1 month, December 1880, at the start of the month, he was first called Billy the Kid. By the end of the month, he was a national celebrity. There were newspapers in New York writing up often very embellished stories of this outlaw in New Mexico, Billy the Kid. In less than a month. It was crazy. It happened so fast. And the funny thing was, they asked Billy what he thought of his fame while he was in the Santa Fe jail after Pat Garrett captured him. And he said, I don't see any money. That's what Billy said. He said, I don't see any money, which was true. There wasn't any money in it for him, but there's been money in it for a lot of other people in the 140 years since.
But what sealed Billy the Kid's fate as a Wild West legend was his epic jailbreak on April 28, 1881. Billy had sweet-talked a guard into letting him out of his cell so he could use the outhouse. On the way back in, Billy enacted his escape from the Lincoln County Courthouse,
which was the single most spectacular jailbreak in American frontier history. Nobody ever escaped jail like that before or since. Bonnie was being kept in the Lincoln County Courthouse, but he was being kept under very close guard. And there were two guards. One of the guards was James W. Bell, who was actually a fugitive himself at the time. He had fled bonds from Texas for his involvement in the murder of a farmer, and he became a lawman. That's how the West was. Then the other deputy that was guarding Billy was Bob Ollinger, and him and the kid absolutely hated one another. Bob Ollinger was a full-blown psychopath. Pat Garrett even later said that he was afraid to sleep around Bob Ollinger because he was afraid that Ollinger would shoot him in his sleep. But he was a lawman too. This is how it was in the West. You could rob across the American West, Southwest, especially at that time. You could rob banks and be an outlaw and murder people in one territory, then go to another territory and be the sheriff. His two guards were guarding him, and Bob Ollinger took these other prisoners over to a restaurant for supper, leaving Bonnie alone with James W. Bell, his guard. Well, apparently Billy asked to be escorted outside of the privy. They went back into the courthouse. Bang! Billy got a hold of Bell's gun. We don't know exactly how for sure. He shot Bell. Well, he told Bell actually to throw his hands up. He didn't want to kill Bell. But Bell ran. Bonnie was going to do what he felt he had to do. Bang! Put a bullet through Bell. And then he grabbed Bob Ollinger's shotgun. This is all while he's still in, cuffs and chains, with leg shackles on. And Bob Ollinger, of course, heard the shot from the restaurant, came running right into the line of fire, and Bonnie was up in the window. Supposedly, he said, "Hello, Bob," boom, and shot Ollinger with his own shotgun, killed him on the spot. He then spent about an hour trying to get the chains off his leg. He eventually decided he tied the chains, and he would sort that out later. And he got on a mail clerk's horse, county clerk's horse, Billy Burt. He shook hands with everybody. And at one stage, he actually stood out on the balcony and justified his actions to the townsfolk. He's in the middle of a jailbreak and he stops to stand out on the balcony. What did he say? His words were, "I'm standing pat against the world." Basically saying, I'm doing what I have to do to avoid being hanged. And he shook hands with everyone, and then he rode out of town singing.
Literally singing?
Right? Yeah, well, according to some people, eyewitnesses who were there, he rode out of town singing a tune. And then the next day, the horse that he rode out of town on, which didn't belong to him, came running back into Lincoln, and he'd sent the horse back because he promised that he'd send the horse back to the owner.
Billy relished in his newfound freedom amongst those he felt closest to.
And he spent pretty much the next year after that living mostly among the Hispanos, the Nuevo Mexicanos, the Mexican Americans, who, as one of his many amigos, Paco Anaya, said, Billy preferred to be with Mexicans than with Americans. Billy actually enjoyed spending time amongst the Hispano population. Those were his people. He spoke fluent Spanish.
3 months after Billy's escape, Sheriff Pat Garrett received intel that the kid was staying in Fort Sumner. Originally an Army outpost, Fort Sumner had blossomed into a community in Lincoln County.
And so Billy then kept very quiet for the next few months and spent a good portion of that time trying to convince his querida, the love of his life, Paulita Maxwell, who was 16 and a half at the time. Bonnie was about 20, 21, trying to convince her he was going to leave the territory, but he wanted Paulita to come with him. He wanted them to elope. And according to Paulita's younger sister, there were actually plans for them to elope. They were going to flee to old Mexico together. Paulita had an older brother named Peter Maxwell. He didn't like that at all. And he actually back-channeled information down into Lincoln to Pat Garrett that Bonnie was up in Sumner. You can find him up here.
In July of 1881, 21-year-old Billy the Kid walked into a trap set by Sheriff Garrett with the help of Paulita's brother. The unsuspecting kid went over to Paulita's house that night.
And he spotted 2 strange men on the porch in the dark. This is about 12:30 at night. And those 2 men were Pat Garrett's deputies. Pat Garrett was in Pete Maxwell's bedroom, sitting on the side of Pete Maxwell's bed, talking with Maxwell, saying, "Have you seen the kid? Where is he?" Well, Billy, when he spotted these 2 strange men, he jumped up on the porch with the pistol drawn and kept asking them, Ken S, who is it? He didn't know who they were, so he wasn't just going to shoot them. And he kept asking them that, and he backed into Pete Maxwell's bedroom to ask Pete Maxwell, and he did ask Pete Maxwell, "Pedro, who are those men outside?" Pat Garrett recognized his voice, and Pete Maxwell actually whispered to Garrett, LS, it's him. So Pat Garrett jerked out his gun and went. Billy was stood there. He recognized like a bit of a figure in the room. It was pitch dark, and he started backing across the room, asking again, Ken S, who is it? And Garrett answered with a bullet, bang, right in the chest, just above the heart. He fired another shot that went wide, and Billy fell forward onto the floor of the Maxwell bedroom and died within about 30 seconds.
The grief of the Hispano people was overwhelming.
The Hispanos at Fort Sumner were absolutely furious because they loved Billy. And Pat Garrett and his deputies had to retreat into the Maxwell house and had to stay there all night. They were afraid for their own lives. And the Hispanos were very, very angry. A lot of the Hispano women spent the night crying over Billy's body. They held a wake for him, and he was buried the following afternoon in the cemetery. And pretty much almost the entire population of Fort Sumner, which would have been over 200 people, followed the little casket down. And Bonnie was laid to rest in the old military cemetery in Fort Sumner, and he's still buried there today. You can go see his grave. Although there's a cage around it, people kept chipping bits of the headstone off as souvenirs.
I highly recommend James Mill's new book, In the Days of Billy the Kid.
But I knew my work wasn't finished, and I wanted to dive deeper into the Hispano side of not just Bonnie's life, but that whole history. The new book's narrative, it stretches from the 1850s all the way to the 1930s. So even there's mentions in it of John Dillinger and like the new generation of Outlaws that came along during the Depression, when these guys, the central figures in this book, were all getting older and getting ready to call it a day with their lives.
One of the things that always like creeps me out is how people will try to take souvenirs back in the day of famous dead people, and just like try to take locks of their hair, and like it's really gruesome. Was there any of that happening with Billy the Kid?
There was myths told that someone chopped off one of his trigger fingers, that there was a lock of hair taken. There's nothing to found that. The Hispanos were very protective of Billy's body. They weren't going to let anybody mess around with him. They adored him, especially the women. Delavina Maxwell, who was a Navajo woman who had originally been purchased by the Maxwell family as a slave, and she became a maid. Now, she was like Billy's surrogate mother. And she actually abused Pat Garrett that night. She pounded his chest and called him a piss pot and every name she could lay her tongue to, because he killed her, as she called him, her little boy. And they would have been very protective of Billy's corpse. Everything would have been very respectful. And Billy now, and that was in 1881, it's over 140 years later, he's the single biggest box office attraction in the history of New Mexico. There's been more films made about him, over 60 movies made about him all, and he has carried the lion's share of New Mexico's tourism business on his shoulders. So it's pretty much Billy the Kid and Roswell, the Roswell incident. That's pretty much, maybe the Teapot Dome scandal is slightly lesser effect. But yeah, but he's still the best known man in New Mexico. He's better or worse, that's his state.
Up next, Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host Brandon Morgan and I will discuss the legend of Billy the Kid in more detail. And as always, thanks for listening. From Pie in the Sky Media, Criminal Mischief is an EVO production, recorded live in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. For EVO Creative, I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.